September 15th, 1916, Somme River, northern France. The battlefield is silent in the early morning mist. The ground is chewed into a wasteland of craters and tangled wire, dotted with the wreckage of failed assaults. German sentries, exhausted and numb, peer across no man's land through the drifting haze. Then, a low mechanical growl begins to rise from the fog. Not the scream of shells, not the rattle of rifles, something deeper, something new. A grey silhouette emerges through the smoke. It's angular, hulking, moving where nothing should move, over trenches, across shell holes, dragging itself like a beast made of steel. German machine gunners blink in disbelief. Some laugh. They think it's a crude British trick, some lumbering box on wheels. They open fire. The bullets ricochet. The monster keeps coming. Its treads grind through the mud, crushing barbed wire and shattered timber. The machine shudders, groans, but it advances. Inside, men of the British Heavy Section, Machine Gun Corps, suffocate in heat and fumes. The air is thick with cordite and oil, the engines roaring beneath their boots. Every turn of the crank, every lurch forward feels like defying physics itself. Above the din, a voice shouts, "Keep her moving." Outside, the Germans stop laughing. Their bullets bounce harmlessly off the metal plates. Panic ripples through the trenches. Some flee, others freeze as the tank crosses the parapet and fires its 6-pounder gun directly into their strong point. The explosion rips through sandbags and men alike. For the first time in history, the battlefield is no longer ruled by men, but by machines. Later that day, near Flers-Courcelette, a German private would write in his diary, "We did not know what it was. It came out of the fog like an iron house. Our rifles were useless. We could not stop it." By dusk, the British advance had gained ground that months of slaughter had failed to take. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was a sign, a mechanical prophecy of what warfare was about to become. In London, a small group of engineers and officers had spent months in secret designing this weapon, a weapon so unusual they had disguised its purpose even from their own troops. They called it a landship. But to conceal it from spies and skeptics, they gave it a code name that would soon echo through history. They called it the tank. When those iron beasts first crawled across the Somme, even British commanders scarcely believed what they were seeing. The tank's debut was not the culmination of a confident plan. It was, in truth, the product of desperation, improvisation, and secrecy. The story began in 1915 when the Western Front had congealed into stalemate. The British Expeditionary Force had already lost tens of thousands trying to break through German lines armed with barbed wire, concrete bunkers, and machine guns. Every offensive ended the same way. Mass slaughter for a few yards of mud. Something had to change. A small circle of officers and inventors began whispering about a mechanical solution. Among them was Colonel Ernest Swinton, a military engineer who had seen how machine guns dominated modern warfare. He imagined an armoured vehicle that could roll over trenches, resist bullets, and carry guns of its own. At first, his reports were dismissed as fantasy. A land battleship, they laughed. But Swinton found an unexpected ally in Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill had a flair for the unorthodox. He authorised the formation of a top-secret committee known as the Landships Committee, hidden within the Navy to deflect army bureaucracy. Its mission, to build a tracked armoured vehicle capable of crossing no man's land. It was an experiment conducted in silence. Engineers worked in old shipyards and abandoned factories, building wooden mock-ups to test steering and balance. Early prototypes broke down within minutes. Some could barely turn. The heat inside was unbearable and the fumes suffocating. Critics in the War Office called the idea a lunatic's toy. To maintain secrecy, the project's logistics were disguised. When parts began shipping across the country, they were labelled innocuously as water tanks for Russia. The name stuck, tank, and what had begun as a cover term would soon define an entire class of weaponry. By early 1916, the prototype known as Mother finally worked. It was slow, heavy, and imperfect, but it could cross trenches and shrug off bullets. The idea was no longer a joke, it was real. Behind this invention lay a paradox. The world's first armoured vehicles were born not from military foresight, but from institutional resistance, from the refusal of generals to imagine that the battlefield itself could evolve. The Landships Committee had lit a fuse under the old world of warfare, and on the Somme that fuse had just exploded. Long before the tank was born, its ancestors rumbled quietly through the fields of Lincolnshire. In the early 1900s, the British company William Foster and Co. built heavy agricultural tractors, steam-powered behemoths used to haul ploughs through sticky English soil. These machines had power, traction, and an almost living stubbornness against terrain. When the war erupted in 1914, those same qualities suddenly mattered not for farming, but for survival. Engineers like William Tritton, the managing director of Foster & Co., and an eccentric naval officer named Walter Gordon Wilson were approached by Churchill's secret Landships Committee. The brief was simple yet audacious: build a machine that could cross trenches, crush wire, and carry guns. The impossible, in other words. The pair began experimenting in the autumn of 1915 using the American Holt Caterpillar tractor as their starting point. Holt's continuous track system, originally designed for farm work in California, offered a way to spread the machine's weight across soft ground, but it wasn't enough. The British prototypes kept bogging down, their tracks snapping under pressure. In an old foundry in Lincoln, Tritton and Wilson worked through nights lit by oil lamps, welding new frames, adjusting gearboxes and modifying tracks. Their early models, codenamed Little Willie and Big Willie, looked crude and awkward, more like metal sheds than weapons. But each failure taught them something vital about balance, traction and armour distribution. Little Willie could move, but not well. It sank in the mud and couldn't climb a trench. Big Willie, later renamed Mother, changed everything. By extending the tracks around the entire hull, it could crawl over obstacles that had stopped every design before. The machine was ugly, loud, and unbearably hot inside. But in January 1916, during a demonstration for military officials, it did the unthinkable. It crossed a 9-foot-wide trench without stopping. The observers stood silent. The age of the armoured vehicle had just begun. Mother became the blueprint for the Mark I, the world's first operational tank. The Mark I came in two variants: the male, fitted with two 6-pounder naval guns, and the female, armed with machine guns for infantry support. Its armour was only 8mm thick, barely enough to stop rifle fire, but it symbolised something far greater: the first real fusion of industrial power and battlefield purpose. It was a weapon that belonged to neither land nor sea, born from the marriage of naval steelwork and agricultural mechanics, and it was built not by soldiers but by craftsmen, welders, machinists and factory women who, unknowingly, were creating a revolution. The industrial age had finally rolled onto the battlefield. To understand what those early tanks truly were, one must imagine the inside of a small steel furnace. No light, no clean air, only heat, smoke and noise so violent it vibrated in your bones. A Mark I tank was less a vehicle than a moving machine shop stitched together from riveted plates and pulsing with steam-age mechanics. The crew, 8 men in total, operated in conditions that blurred the line between bravery and punishment. Inside, the Daimler Foster 6-cylinder petrol engine produced about 105 horsepower, barely enough to push the 28-ton vehicle past 312 miles per hour on flat ground. The engine sat exposed in the middle of the hull, radiating heat that could raise the interior temperature above 50 degrees Celsius. There was no insulation. Crewmen wrapped their hands in rags to avoid burns from hot metal. Communication was almost impossible. The roar of gears and clatter of tracks drowned every shout, so the men kicked each other's legs to signal commands. When the engine backfired, flames sometimes shot through the compartment. Fuel fumes mixed with exhaust. Some crews fainted from carbon monoxide. The stench of oil, sweat and cordite hung thick enough to taste. Visibility was another nightmare. Narrow slits, barely half an inch wide, served as vision ports. The driver, positioned near the centre, could see almost nothing. Steering required 2 men using brake levers and clutch pedals in choreographed rhythm. The slightest misstep sent the tank veering wildly off course. But the design's genius lay in its simplicity. The rhomboid shape, with tracks running the full length of the body, allowed the tank to climb out of trenches, crush wire, and span shell craters. Its riveted armour deflected small arms fire and shrapnel. Mounted guns on side sponsons gave it a wide firing arc, each 6-pounder capable of destroying machine gun nests or field emplacements. Still, the Mark I was an experiment. It broke down frequently, bogged in mud and overheated after hours of crawling. Crews carried tools, spare parts, and sometimes planks to unstick themselves mid-battle. Yet even these failures taught critical lessons about ground pressure, suspension, and the limits of steel on soft earth. What made the tank revolutionary wasn't just its mechanics, it was its philosophy. For centuries, war had been dominated by manpower and mobility on horseback. The tank inverted that hierarchy. Industrial power now shielded the soldier rather than exposing him. It transformed engines into armour, factories into fortresses. This was not evolution, it was rupture. The Mark I and its descendants didn't merely change tactics, they rewrote the logic of the battlefield. The moment a machine could move and kill independently, warfare entered a new mechanical era, one in which courage was measured not by the charge but by the ignition of an engine. The first tanks were as divisive as they were daring. In 1916, the British Army, steeped in cavalry tradition, did not take kindly to the notion that the horse, the rifle and the gallant charge might soon be replaced by roaring machines that stank of oil and smoke. Inside the War Office, critics called the tanks mechanical follies. Some commanders insisted that the infantry will always decide the day. They viewed these armoured vehicles as unreliable and unchivalrous, a violation of the supposed romance of battle. Even among their allies, the tank's champions faced ridicule. One general dismissed them as overgrown toys that frighten only those who have never seen a tractor. Another warned that resources spent on tanks were better used for more artillery shells. But outside the boardrooms and headquarters, the men in the mud saw something else entirely. Infantry officers who had watched thousands die against machine gun fire began to understand the tank's promise. It was a shield, a mobile fortress that could roll through obstacles that had devoured whole battalions. The conflict was not only technological, it was psychological. The old world of warfare, built on discipline and human valour, was being invaded by machines that seemed to act with a will of their own. Soldiers who once fought shoulder to shoulder were now encased in steel boxes, navigating terrain through slits and vibrations. The bond between man and machine had begun, but few yet realised it. Meanwhile, across the lines, German observers reported with alarm the strange British machines that appeared on the Somme. At first they scoffed. German newspapers mocked the English armoured ovens, publishing caricatures of them breaking down in mud. But behind the ridicule, the Oberste Heeresleitung, Germany's high command, ordered urgent studies. By early 1917, they had begun developing countermeasures, special armour-piercing bullets, field guns repositioned for direct fire, and eventually designs for their own tank, the A7V. Ironically, the A7V was the mirror image of the British Mark I, heavier, boxier, crewed by 18 men, and armed with a single 57mm gun. Only 20 were ever built, but their appearance marked a turning point, the moment both sides realised that the tank was not a gimmick. It was an arms race in steel. Yet within Britain, divisions persisted. Many strategists still saw tanks as mere infantry support, useful but not decisive. A few visionaries disagreed. J.F.C. Fuller, a young British staff officer, began writing papers arguing that tanks could operate independently en masse to punch through enemy lines and collapse entire fronts. His ideas were revolutionary, and ignored. The paradox deepened. The British had invented the tank but could not yet imagine its true potential. While generals debated, the war rolled on. Mud swallowed men and machines alike. The tank's engines sputtered, their armour cracked, but their presence on the battlefield had already changed how every soldier thought about war. The next great clash would prove whether these steel monsters were a passing novelty, or the beginning of a new kind of warfare altogether. November 20th, 1917, Cambrai, France. Dawn broke under a low grey sky as 1,000 British guns thundered in perfect unison. But this time, there was something different about the battlefield. No long preliminary bombardment to churn the ground into chaos, no signal flares or bugle calls. Instead, from behind the lines, a sound like rolling thunder began to build. Engines, hundreds of them, revving in rhythm. It was the beginning of the Battle of Cambrai, the first large-scale test of tank warfare in history. Across the British sector, 476 Mark IV tanks stood ready, heavier, better armoured, and more reliable than their predecessors. Each one carried a crew of 8 and moved with grim determination toward the German Hindenburg Line, an elaborate fortress of trenches, concrete bunkers and barbed wire. The plan was audacious. Instead of the slow, grinding artillery-driven attacks of the past, British Commander General Julian Byng aimed for surprise and speed. Tanks would crush the wire, silence machine guns and open corridors for infantry and cavalry to surge through, a coordinated strike of men and metal. At 6:20 a.m. they advanced. Through the morning haze, rows of tanks emerged like a steel tide. German troops, expecting the usual creeping barrage, were caught unprepared. Barbed wire, once impassable, flattened beneath the tracks. Machine gun nests vanished under 6-pounder fire. Infantry followed close behind, cheering as they passed through intact gaps in the wire for the first time in the war. Within hours, the British had advanced 5 miles, a miracle by the standards of trench warfare. German communications collapsed, strongpoints fell one after another. The sight of dozens of tanks moving in formation shocked even Allied observers. The tank had fulfilled its promise. But the triumph didn't last. Byng's forces lacked reserves to exploit the breach. Many tanks broke down after hours of hard running. Gearboxes shattered, tracks slipped, engines overheated. And soon German artillery regrouped, pinpointing the tanks' slow movements and knocking them out one by one. Within days, German counterattacks retook much of the lost ground. Still, Cambrai had proved the concept. For the first time, an armoured assault had demonstrated what coordinated mechanized warfare could achieve. It was no longer theory, it was doctrine in the making. April 1918, Villers-Bretonneux. In the chill of early morning, the world's first tank versus tank battle unfolded. German A7Vs advanced toward British lines, lumbering forward like steel barns. 3 British Mark IVs were dispatched to intercept them. At a range of a few hundred yards, the two sides opened fire. Shells slammed into armour, sparks flying. Inside the cramped cabins, crews reloaded feverishly in choking smoke. One British gunner, Corporal Arthur Inglis, fired the decisive shot, striking the German A-7V Nix squarely and sending it reeling into a ditch. The surviving Germans fled on foot. It was a brief skirmish, but symbolically seismic, the first duel between machines built to hunt each other. The battlefield had become industrialised not just in production, but in combat itself. By 1918, tanks appeared in every major Allied offensive. At Amiens, over 500 British and French tanks led the assault that cracked the German front, prompting General Ludendorff to call August 8th the Black Day of the German army. The old certainties of trench warfare disintegrated under the roar of internal combustion. And yet, even amid victory, the cost was staggering. Crews died of fumes and heat exhaustion as often as from enemy fire. Hundreds of tanks were lost to mechanical failure. But the psychological effect was irreversible. German soldiers began referring to tanks with awe and dread. Stahl monster, steel monsters. Those who once laughed at them now whispered prayers when they heard engines in the fog. Cambrai had proven something deeper than tactics, that the side capable of merging man and machine, industry and imagination, would shape the future of war. But the Great War ended before that future could fully arrive. The tank was still crude, underpowered and misunderstood. It would take another generation and another world war for its true potential to be unleashed. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the tank was both a triumph and an orphan. It had helped end the Great War, but in the peace that followed, few nations truly understood what they had created. In Britain, the birthplace of the tank, its makers were quietly sidelined. The wartime tank corps was disbanded, budgets slashed, and armoured research forgotten amid the politics of peace. Generals congratulated themselves on victory and returned to their faith in infantry and artillery. The machine that had broken the stalemate was shelved as a curiosity, another special weapon of a war too terrible to repeat. But a few refused to forget. Major General J.F.C. Fuller, frustrated by military conservatism, began writing visionary papers proposing that future wars would be won not by manpower, but by speed and concentration, by entire armoured formations striking deep behind enemy lines. He imagined swarms of fast tanks supported by mobile aircraft, cutting off armies before they could even react. His 1919 plan, the outline of the armoured warfare, was decades ahead of its time. Most of his superiors laughed. Britain, crippled by economic strain, built only a handful of experimental tanks through the 1920s. The dream of mechanized warfare languished in dusty garages and half-funded trials on Salisbury Plain. Meanwhile, abroad, others were watching and learning. In Germany, forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles to build tanks at all, military thinkers studied Fuller's theories in secret. Among them was a young officer named Heinz Guderian, who devoured British writings on mechanized tactics. In the 1930s, as Germany rearmed under Hitler, Guderian would turn those ideas into doctrine, combining tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft into a single, fast-moving weapon of shock and maneuver, blitzkrieg. Ironically, it was the British who had invented the tank, and the Germans who would perfect its use. Elsewhere, France pursued a more cautious path, building heavily armoured but slow machines like the Char B-1 designed for defence, not offence. The Soviet Union, under Mikhail Tukhachevsky, experimented with deep battle, massive mechanized thrusts across hundreds of miles. And in the United States, engineers such as J. Walter Christie developed radical suspension systems that would later shape both Allied and Soviet designs in the Second World War. The tank had become a symbol of national identity and industrial power. Each rivet and engine reflected a country's philosophy: British practicality, German precision, Soviet scale. By the late 1930s, production lines once used for tractors and automobiles now built armoured divisions. War was being mechanized, not just by invention, but by economy itself. The battlefield had merged with the factory floor. What had begun as a desperate experiment in the mud of the Somme was becoming the architecture of a new world conflict. When the first tanks rolled into battle in 1916, they were hailed as saviours, mechanical angels that would shield soldiers from the horror of open ground. The men who built them dreamed not of conquest, but of rescue, to protect flesh with steel, to break the stalemate that had slaughtered a generation. Yet within 30 years, those same machines would thunder across Europe in numbers the inventors could never have imagined, not as shields but as instruments of terror. By the dawn of World War II, tanks were no longer the awkward beasts of the Somme. They were faster, stronger, and mass-produced by the tens of thousands. At Sedan in 1940, German panzer divisions pierced the French lines in days, using mobility and coordination to bypass defences that had been thought impregnable. Paris fell not after months of siege, but after weeks of speed. The weapon that Britain had forged to end the stalemate now unleashed a new form of total war. It was a cruel irony. The tank, Conceived as a means to protect soldiers from the futility of trench slaughter, instead industrialized destruction. No longer was war fought in trenches or by individual valor. It was waged through machinery, fuel, and logistics. Humanity had built a weapon to master the battlefield, and in doing so had surrendered a part of its own mastery. Even the language changed. Where once men charged and retreated, now they advanced mechanized units. Armies became engines and soldiers, operators. The tank was not just a machine, it was a metaphor for the new century. Unstoppable, armoured, efficient, and indifferent. For veterans of the Great War, the transformation was haunting. Colonel Swinton, one of the fathers of the tank, reportedly watched German armour sweep across Europe with disbelief. What he had once imagined as a breakthrough to peace had become the backbone of Blitzkrieg. The machine built to end the machine gun age had instead crowned it. More than a century after the first Mark I lurched across the Somme, its descendants still define the silhouette of modern war. The tank has evolved, its shape sleeker, its armour composite, its mind increasingly digital. But the logic remains the same: survival through mobility, dominance through engineering. The modern battlefield is far from the mud of 1916, yet its rhythm is eerily familiar. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, US M1A1 Abrams tanks crossed the Kuwaiti desert at 45 miles per hour, faster than World War I biplanes, destroying Iraqi armour with computer-guided precision. The Battle of 73 Easting became a textbook demonstration of technological supremacy, the tank as a sensor-laden predator, hunting targets before being seen. In Ukraine, a century after Cambrai, the cycle has turned again. Drone footage shows armoured columns threading through burned-out villages, tanks once more battling artillery, mines and mud. Yet the nature of warfare has split in two. The same steel beasts that once symbolised unstoppable power now share the field with silent aerial eyes, cyber interference and unmanned ground vehicles. And still, the tank endures. Its survival is not just mechanical, it's psychological. The tank remains a symbol of control, a physical manifestation of strength in a digital age. When a tank rolls into a city, it does more than project force. It asserts the presence of power in a world increasingly governed by invisible signals. The irony, however, deepens. Modern armour is layered with sensors, computers, and reactive plating, yet it is still vulnerable to the same primal weaknesses: terrain, mobility, and human error. A cheap missile, a hidden drone, or a well-placed mine can cripple a machine that costs millions. The balance between invention and vulnerability, between dominance and obsolescence, remains as delicate as it was on the Somme. But the tank's legacy goes beyond the battlefield. It reshaped cities, politics, and even imagination. The tank became a language of fear and pride, appearing in parades, propaganda, and revolutions. From the Red Square to Tiananmen, it stood as both symbol and warning, a machine that could either liberate or crush. In that sense, the tank outlived its inventors not as a weapon but as a philosophy, that the union of man and machine could decide the fate of nations. The same dream and the same danger now extends into the 21st century, as AI-guided vehicles and autonomous drones take the place once held by human crews. The next generation of tanks may not carry soldiers at all, but their lineage, their very logic, can be traced back to those first clattering beasts crawling through the fog in 1916. On that cold September morning in 1916, when the first tank crawled from the mist, German soldiers laughed. They saw a lumbering curiosity, a noisy box of bolts trudging through the mud, ridiculous, almost comic. But by the time it reached their trenches, the laughter had turned to silence. The battlefield had changed forever, and with it, the soul of war. From that moment on, man and machine were bound. The tank was not just an invention, it was a mirror. It reflected humanity's will to survive, and its readiness to turn imagination into destruction. Each evolution in armour and engine told a story of our paradox, that the tools we build to save ourselves often become the instruments that threaten us most. The tank's lineage stretches across a century of contradictions. Born to end suffering, it mechanized it. Designed to protect, it came to symbolize oppression. Yet, within its steel skin, it still carried human fragility, crews sweating, choking, praying, trapped in heat and noise, doing the impossible simply to move forward. Behind every plate of armour was a pulse, behind every rumble an act of human endurance. Even today, the tank remains more than a weapon. It is a testament to ingenuity, to fear, to the enduring human need to control chaos. Whether crossing the mud of Flanders, the dunes of Iraq, or the highways of Ukraine, each armoured vehicle carries within it the same ancient tension, the yearning for safety and the price of power. In the twilight of the mechanized age, new machines rise, silent drones, autonomous craft, weapons guided by algorithms instead of eyes. yet their ancestry can be traced to that first British landship conceived by dreamers in secrecy, built by hands that believed they were changing the nature of death itself. Perhaps they did. Because what began as a desperate solution to a hopeless war became a symbol of the 20th century, the century when humanity fused its destiny with the machine. And if you listen closely, in the echoes of history, you can still hear that sound, the grinding of steel over mud, the heartbeat of engines born from fear and genius alike. The laughter that once greeted them has long since faded. Only the echo remains, a reminder that progress once unleashed never stops moving forward,